"Tu meu salario se traduzir eso." The sentence burst out from the mouth of a man in an expensive suit, his laugh sharp and loud as if the world belonged solely to him, and everyone else was just background noise. The office fell silent for a moment, then exploded in laughter, mocking and cruel. No one could have imagined that this arrogant challenge would be the spark that would shatter the illusion he had carefully built around himself. And the one to trigger that earthquake was not a finance expert, nor a high-profile lawyer, but a woman in a janitor uniform pushing a cleaning cart down the hallway. Renata Silva, 43 years old, had worked there for 2 years. She was used to the side glances, the careless comments, the way people pushed past her, as if her presence disrupted the design of the pristine marble floors. Used to it did not mean it did not hurt. Every time someone shoved her aside, every time laughter echoed behind her back, Renata would press her lips together, lower her head, and retreat to a quiet corner, fading into the background like a shadow. No one asked what she used to study, where she came from, or what she dreamed of. To them, she was just the one who picked up trash. That Tuesday, the first one of March, the sun was blazing and the air in the office was thick with tension. Danilo Souza had just lost a multi-million-dollar deal the week before, and everyone knew he was looking for someone to unleash his rage on. When he stepped into the 15th floor lobby and saw Renata's cart blocking his path, he didn't hesitate. He shoved it hard, causing bottles of cleaning liquid to clatter onto the polished floor. Renata staggered, almost fell, but steadied herself and said softly, "I'm sorry." Danilo didn't even look at her, just sneered and walked past toward his office, where his secretary Mariana was already waiting with his schedule. Mariana gently reminded him that Renata was just doing her job, that it was a shared hallway. Danilo cut her off uninterested. "Who allowed a janitor to stand in the hallway? When I'm walking through," he snapped. "Does she think this is her house?" That might have been the end of it, as it had been so many times before. If not for the strange parcel Danilo received that very afternoon. A thick envelope delivered by express mail, sealed with international stamps addressed directly to him. Inside was a stack of documents filled with twisted letters in a language he had never seen before. The symbols were odd, the structure unreadable, and he scowled in frustration. "What kind of nonsense is this?" he muttered, waving the papers in the air like a prop in a comedy show staged for the entire office. As expected, he started yelling. Mariana scrambled to call translation agencies. Every one of them declined. The language in question was Hungarian. None of the city's services had a specialist available on such short notice. Danilo's fury boiled over. He slammed his hand on the desk and shouted that a city of 8 million people couldn't produce a single person who could read some ridiculous paper. People began whispering. No one had a solution. They just stood around waiting, hoping someone would calm the storm. That was Danilo. Then suddenly Danilo stood up, waving the stack of papers like a challenge. "Listen up," he shouted. "I'll give my entire month's salary to anyone who can translate this alien gibberish." His laughter rang out across the office. Others joined in. Jokes flew. Someone yelled, "I'll learn Martian in 5 minutes." A few clapped. What began as a meltdown had now become a group spectacle. No one noticed the woman in the corner of the hallway under the pale light of the fluorescent ceiling, still holding her mop. Renata was watching. When Danilo raised the papers, her eyes followed. And when they landed on the unfamiliar characters, she froze. She recognized every word. every symbol. As if the past she had worked so hard to bury had suddenly returned in this sweltering afternoon filled with mocking laughter. Renata knew that language, not just the vocabulary, but the syntax, the rhythm, the culture embedded within each line, because that had once been her life, her work. And now this man was using it as a joke. She could step forward. She could speak up right then and there, but she stayed quiet. She watched. She saw herself reflected in their ridicule. She saw the contempt, the assumptions pinned to someone in a blue uniform holding a mop. They didn't need to know who she was. They just needed her to step back when they walked forward. But this time she would not step back, not for the 45,000 reais, but because truth deserves to be heard. Because there are people who, even when the world treats them as invisible, carry their worth like a flame inside coal. And when the moment is right, that flame rises, not to burn, but to illuminate those blinded by arrogance. Renata placed her mop against the wall. She stepped out of the shadow. And then, in a voice that was steady, not loud, not quiet, but firm enough that everyone heard, she said, "I can translate those documents." And that was the moment everything began to change. Not because she could translate, but because she chose to step forward, to face them, to be herself in a room full of people who believed she was no one. No one answered, no one reacted. Just a strange silence spreading across the room that had moments ago been filled with laughter. Dozens of eyes slowly turned toward the woman who had just spoken. A light blue uniform, a face without makeup, a gaze that held neither defiance nor submission. Danilo turned around, frowned, then gave a dry laugh as if he had just heard something utterly ridiculous. "What did you just say? You want to translate those papers?" He said, his voice soaked in mockery, the kind of tone people like Renata had heard so many times they could recite every syllable of contempt by heart. "I can translate it," Renata repeated, not loud, not soft, but firm. The room erupted again, but this time it was not joyful laughter. It was a mess of surprise, doubt, and discomfort. Someone gave a dry chuckle. Another whispered, "She probably thinks it's Spanish." Someone else muttered that janitors watched too many movies and started to believe they were undercover agents. But Renata did not respond. She just stood there, arms relaxed at her sides, eyes locked on the documents Danilo was holding. She did not need to say anything else. Everything she had to say was already clear in her calm gaze. Danilo walked over, waving the documents in his hand, still holding that smug grin. "All right then. If you think you know Hungarian, prove it. But remember, the moment you get one word wrong, I'll ask you to apologize in front of everyone for wasting our time." Renata nodded, not because she felt the need to prove anything to Danilo, but because she knew there would never be a better moment to tear down the curtain of prejudice that blinded so many to the truth behind uniforms and titles. She reached out gently, taking the papers from Danilo's hand. The sheets were thick, official sealed, and carried that distinct scent of legal offices. The moment her eyes met the first line, she knew she was not mistaken. It was Hungarian, the language she had once taught for over a decade in advanced linguistic courses at the university. But it was more than just language. She recognized the legal structure, the formal phrasing, the formatting. This was not garbage, as Danilo had called it. These were international inheritance documents, notarized and clearly marked with a response deadline. Renata took a deep breath, as if waking up a part of her that had been asleep for 2 years. From her lips, the first words came out in an accent so precise no one dared to laugh anymore. She read the opening paragraph, then translated line by line into clear and fluent Portuguese. The room was dead silent. Not a movement. Danilo stood frozen, as if each word from the woman he once dismissed was pinning him to the floor. Mariana was the first to break the heavy air. She stepped closer, eyes scanning the papers, comparing them to Renata's spoken translation. Accurate to the decimal, flawless legal structure, technical vocabulary no ordinary student could master. Mariana looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. Renata, how do you know all this? Renata did not look up. She kept turning pages, kept translating, kept explaining every clause without even pausing for breath. The room stayed frozen. Those who had laughed just moments ago now glanced at each other, unable to say a word. Danilo took a step back, then sank into his chair, both hands pressed against the table as if someone had slapped his pride. He could not believe it. The woman he had called garbage was now untangling a mess that could cost him his entire fortune. A cold sensation crept up his spine, not because he feared losing money, but because for the first time in his life he felt completely seen by someone he had believed was beneath him. Renata stopped after finishing the main section. She raised her head. Her eyes met Danilo's. No anger, no resentment. Just a direct, honest look full of clarity. In that brief moment, Danilo realized he had lived 2 years in the same building as a woman whose full name he never knew, whose origins he never asked, about whose dreams never once crossed his mind. He had never imagined that beneath that janitor's uniform was a mind that had spoken at international conferences, written academic papers in multiple languages, and lived a life more admirable than most in that room. No one said another word. The jokes from earlier now echoed like slaps in the face. People can pretend not to know, can ignore truth, but they cannot deny what they just witnessed. Renata had proven herself without raising her voice, without fury, without revenge. She simply did her job with the calm of someone who had never lost her essence, even when the world treated her like she had no worth. And at that moment, Danilo understood that he had just made the dumbest promise of his life. A challenge that once seemed harmless, now wrapped tightly around his ego. I'll give you my salary if you can translate this. One arrogant sentence, one collective laugh now replaced by shame-lowered heads and silence. Renata did not need the money. She had already claimed something far greater, the truth, and the restoration of her dignity right where it had been trampled. As for Danilo, he did not yet realize that this lesson was just beginning. Danilo stared at Renata as if she had just stepped out of some bizarre dream. The feeling of being stripped bare in the very place where power had once protected him from all mistakes left his throat dry. But survival instincts kicked in. He regained the usual expression of someone used to giving orders. Fine, if you think you are capable, then translate the entire document. Do it now, no mistakes, and if there is even a single inaccuracy, I will consider it fraud. Renata's eyes never left the stack of papers. She nodded slightly, not hesitant, not smug. No one in the office dared to interrupt that moment, not even Mariana. Every murmur had faded after hearing the perfect translation delivered in a voice impossible to challenge. Danilo picked up the phone, asked for a computer to be brought into the meeting room. He demanded a copy of the documents. He told everyone to clear the room. But Renata spoke up. I need silence, a computer with internet access and no interruptions. She said it like someone who had once coordinated simultaneous interpretation at international conferences, not like someone who used to scrub restroom floors. Mariana, hearing that, quickly fetched the key to the 12th floor meeting room, a space usually reserved for confidential sessions with foreign clients. Danilo agreed, having no other choice. His face darkened, but his voice no longer held the absolute authority it once did. Take whatever you need, just finish before 6 o'clock. Renata followed Mariana upstairs. The elevator doors closed slowly behind them, leaving the stares of people who had just realized they might have been wrong for far too long, wrong about the very person most deserving of their respect. Danilo remained frozen in his office, gripping the phone without dialing. Not because he did not know who to call, but because for the first time in his life, he was not sure if there was anything left he had the right to command. The computer was ready, the keyboard spotless, as if waiting for the hands of a skilled professional. Renata sat down, the familiar sensation, waking from a long slumber. She placed the documents beside her eyes, fixed on the blank screen. Her fingers began to move, no hesitation, no errors. Every sentence she typed came with precision, every comma, every clause, every legal term laid out like she had never left her position at the consulate 3 years ago. She did not think of Danilo, not of the laughter from earlier, not even the careless promise of 45,000 reais. All she thought of was doing her job well, just as she had done for nearly 2 decades. Downstairs, things had not returned to normal. Staff members gathered in small groups. Some sat silently. Others scrambled to search on Google just how hard Hungarian really was. Some simply stared into space, recalling their own mocking words from just an hour ago. Mariana, after returning from the 12th floor, went back to her desk and began printing documents that might be needed to respond properly. She was the first to understand the content from an administrative perspective. The seals, the signatures, the formatting, the language, none of it could be fake. It was a legitimate inheritance confirmation letter sent from a respected law firm in Budapest with a deadline for written response that, if missed, would transfer all rights to the local government. Danilo stumbled into his chair in his private office. He leaned back, eyes toward the ceiling. A man like him, proud of never losing a contract due to personal failure, was now facing the possibility of losing millions in inheritance because he failed to recognize a diamond hidden in the dust he stepped on every day. And what shook him even more was not just that Renata knew Hungarian, but the crushing realization that he had been entirely wrong about who she was. Inside the meeting room, Renata kept typing. Not just translating, she explained the terms, the clauses, the deadlines, even suggested how to craft the reply letter according to international norms. She wrote in 2 languages, localizing meaning while preserving technical structure. She poured into it everything she had taught, everything she had done at the consulate, everything she had learned in handling cross-border estate disputes. With every keystroke, she shed another layer of prejudice that had clung to her for the past 2 years. And the more she typed, the more she realized she was no longer a ghost in this building. She was herself, again, the one who had stood at lecterns, spoken at international forums, the real Renata Silva. At 4:15, Mariana stepped into the meeting room with a glass of water and a sandwich. She said nothing, just placed it on the table, looked at Renata, who was deep in focus, and quietly walked away. Sometimes an unspoken gesture at the right time says more than any apology. Renata did not look up, but she knew Mariana had changed. She knew at least one person in the office now saw her differently. Around 5 o'clock, Danilo came upstairs. He stood outside the meeting room, hand raised to knock, but stopped midway. Through the clear glass, he saw Renata sitting upright eyes, glued to the screen, exuding a calm that felt almost sacred. He did not dare interrupt. That woman whom he had once ordered around with arrogance now held his financial fate in her hands. That feeling made him feel small, exposed, and deeply ashamed. And in that moment, he knew if she finished before 6, he would honor his promise. Not because of legality, not because of pride, but because for the first time in his life, he wanted to do the right thing, just once to atone for the arrogance he once mistook for strength. Just once to look in the mirror and not flinch at his own reflection. But he had no idea the lesson he needed to learn was far from over. For there was a past Renata had yet to reveal, a story that no one in that office could have imagined. A story that might forever change how they understood the true value of a person. At exactly 5:45, Renata stepped out of the meeting room, holding a neatly arranged stack of documents in her hand, her eyes calm and unreadable. The long hallway, carpeted in a dark tone, fell silent, as if making way for someone the entire building had once treated as invisible. Each of her footsteps echoed lightly yet firmly, like the rhythm of a soul quietly reclaiming its dignity after 2 long years in the shadows. She did not glance around, paid no attention to the mix of avoidance and curiosity in the eyes that followed her from behind desks lining the corridor. She walked straight to Danilo's office, where the man sat motionless, as if sensing the moment he could no longer delay had finally arrived. Renata placed the documents on the desk, gently pulled out a chair, and sat across from him. She did not need to introduce anything. Danilo did not ask. His eyes locked onto the title of the first translated page. She had not only translated the documents, but also annotated them with technical terminology, explained each clause, offered suggested responses aligned with Hungarian legal standards, and ensured administrative compliance with international requirements. Beside that, she had prepared a response letter in 2 versions, one in Portuguese for internal review, and one finalized in Hungarian, ready to be printed, signed, and dispatched. Danilo picked up the pages one by one. His hand trembled slightly, not from the weight of the documents, but from the weight of the truth. The words on the paper were no longer just strange symbols he once mocked. They now carried the weight of a fortune worth millions of euros, and more than that, revealed the truest image of a woman he had once deemed insignificant. Each annotation by Renata felt like a blade slicing through years of unchecked arrogance, exposing a truth he had long refused to confront. He looked at her not as a boss, but for the first time as someone learning how to treat another human being with decency. Renata calmly pointed to the last section of the translation where the deadline clause was highlighted in bold. 6 o'clock sharp was the final deadline to confirm inheritance. After that, all rights would be void and transferred to the Hungarian government under unclaimed estate law. Danilo checked the time. Less than 15 minutes left. He stood up, said he would personally take the documents to the post office to ensure timely delivery. But before leaving, he turned around and looked directly at Renata, trying to find the words. "I was wrong," he said. No fancy apology, no deflection. Just one sentence, but it carried the weight of a man admitting for the first time that he had failed in how he judged people. Renata neither nodded nor reacted. She simply picked up the original documents and carefully organized them back into the folder. Danilo understood. Some mistakes cannot be erased by words. Some wounds do not need immediate forgiveness, but they do demand the dignity of silence. He left the office running through the lobby documents in hand sweat trickling down his forehead. The receptionist watched him puzzled. Other staff whispered to each other, trying to figure out what was going on. But no one answered because even they could not yet fully understand what was unfolding. They only knew that a seemingly ordinary afternoon had brushed against the thin line separating arrogance from humanity. Meanwhile, Renata remained at her desk, eyes gazing into the distance through the glass window. She was not thinking about money, not about the promised 45,000 reais. She was thinking about her daughter, thinking about the months of eating instant noodles to afford insulin, thinking about the time she held back tears when coworkers sneered. She did not want pity. She only wanted to be acknowledged as someone of worth. Today, that happened, not by crying or demanding, but through action and knowledge. When Danilo returned at 6:20, face flushed shirt, drenched in sweat, holding the express mail receipt, the entire office fell silent. He said nothing. He simply walked over to Renata, placed the receipt on her desk, and sat down across from her. I sent it. Made it in time. They will receive it tomorrow morning. Thank you. Not just for the translation. For everything. For not leaving me behind even though I deserve to be. Renata looked at him. Her eyes no longer held coldness, but something else. Not forgiveness. Recognition. She nodded slightly. I did not help you because you deserved it. I helped because there is a child waiting for me at home and she needs medicine. I helped because if I had not, I would no longer be myself. Her words left Danilo speechless. Not because she mentioned money, but because she spoke of dignity, something he had long lost among numbers and contracts. He looked down at the table, unable to meet her eyes. For the first time, he felt small, not because of wealth, but because of conscience. Outside, the evening light had faded. The room was bathed in the soft hues of twilight falling across the windows. In that moment, a powerful man understood that some lessons cannot be bought with money. And a woman once dismissed as invisible had stepped into the light not to seek revenge, but to prove that silence can be the most powerful voice of all. A new chapter had begun not in a bank account, but in the way a human being looks inward. And everything was only just beginning. The next morning, the office opened with an unusual air. Good morning greetings were timid. Eyes avoided each other as if everyone was trying to rearrange their understanding of the world they thought they knew. The elevator had no more teasing jokes. The coffee machine no longer echoed with laughter. Everyone showed up on time, but no one was truly present. Their minds were still stuck in the previous afternoon, where a woman they had walked past every day had silenced the entire office with her intellect and dignity. Renata arrived at 7 as usual, but today she did not wear the familiar crumpled blue uniform. She chose a clean white shirt and a pair of simple black slacks. No makeup, no accessories, but the way she walked in made the receptionist instinctively stand up, not from surprise, but from a reflexive sense of respect. Paula, the young receptionist, gave a shy smile and invited her to sit in the guest lounge. Renata nodded, opened her bag, and took out a stack of documents she had prepared in advance. She had not come to claim money. She came to make a decision. Danilo appeared at 8:30 earlier than usual. When he saw Renata sitting upright, her face calm, he paused. He no longer saw the cleaning lady from yesterday. In front of him was a professional. someone who made him reassess his entire approach. He invited her to the top-floor meeting room usually reserved for major partners. The air between them was no longer tense, but not quite relaxed either. It was the cautious atmosphere of people who had gone through a shift in awareness and were now trying to adjust to a new truth. "I have considered your offer," Renata began once they had settled. "I accept the translation position, but I have a few conditions." Danilo nodded, did not interrupt. "First, I want to work part-time for the next 2 weeks to train someone to take over the cleaning job. I will not leave that position irresponsibly." He nodded in agreement. "Second, I want all of my salary to be transferred directly to the hospital treating my daughter. No one else should have access to that money." "Agreed," he said immediately, without hesitation. "And lastly, I want the contract to be written clearly, stating my role and rights in the company. I do not want to be misjudged again." Danilo looked at her, his eyes different from the ones he usually wore. It was no longer the gaze of someone in power, but a look of respect for someone who had just reclaimed her rightful place. He agreed. The lawyer would draft the contract today. She could begin work tomorrow or whenever she felt ready. Renata nodded slightly. No handshake, no emotional thank yous, just a solemn silence, as if both understood that what was happening was not a favor, but the restoration of justice. When the news spread, the office once again fell into a strange silence. Renata was officially appointed as Language and International Translation Advisor, a title no one dared to contest, yet one that forced them to confront their own shame in silence. The woman they once looked down on, once mocked behind her back, was now the most crucial figure in the company's international affairs. She did not change because of the title. It was they who had to change to keep up with the new reality. Mariana was the first to approach her. "I owe you an apology. For 2 years, I lacked the courage to see you as a human being." "I know," Renata replied, with no bitterness, no accusation, just the calm acceptance of someone who had endured enough of the world's attitudes. Amanda, the young accountant who often made careless jokes, also timidly stepped forward. "I used to think you did not belong here, but it turns out we are the ones who were out of place." Renata did not respond. She smiled, but it did not linger. She understood those words needed to be said, but she did not need them to forgive. She had forgiven long ago because she knew most of them were merely products of a culture that dismissed differences and equated status with human worth. Danilo called her into his office at the end of the day. He presented her with a new contract, with a higher salary than expected, and a special bonus for helping him secure the international inheritance. Renata read every line, corrected a few small errors, and signed with a firm stroke. When he asked if she needed time off, she shook her head. "I do not want rest. I have been resting for 2 years. Now is the time to rebuild my life." He could only nod. No rebuttal. Because in that moment he realized that some people do not need opportunities to shine. They only need to be seen. As she stood up to leave the office, Danilo called out, "Renata, may I ask you something? Why would someone like you choose to be a cleaner?" The question brought a stillness to the room. She turned around, looked at him directly. "Because I had no other choice. Because I needed health insurance for my daughter. Because my husband was unemployed. Because this society does not forgive those who dare to speak out against injustice." He said nothing, not because he lacked words, but because no words were enough. Renata walked out of the office, leaving behind a man relearning how to be human. And outside, her former colleagues looked at her with eyes that for the first time held no prejudice. Because today, they no longer saw a cleaner walking through the room. They saw a woman who had once been buried, now rising from the ground by her own strength, standing tall with pride and a heart that refused to yield. And to those who were clear-eyed enough to witness it, that was the most beautiful image ever to grace the walls of that office. As Renata sat in front of the computer in her new office, the swivel chair still carried the scent of fresh plastic, and sunlight streamed through the glass windows, brushing gently over her simple white blouse. The room was not large, but it was quiet, and enough for her to place a cup of coffee on the desk, not to wipe it down, but to enjoy it for the first time in 2 years. She did not glance around like someone unfamiliar with the space. She sat in her place as if she had always belonged there, only the world had momentarily forgotten. On the screen was a new document from Budapest, a legal file that needed urgent translation within 3 days. She opened it with practiced precision, her eyes quickly scanning the cold, blunt, complex lines of text. These things were once familiar in her previous life. Now they had returned in a different context where her self-respect was no longer worn down by broom bristles or indifferent stares. Outside, the office still operated as usual. Those who once laughed when she stood up to accept the translation task now bowed slightly as they passed her room. A few knocked softly when they needed help, and she nodded every time without holding back. She looked down on no one because she had once stood at the lowest rung a scholar could fall. She had no need to prove she was better than anyone else. She only needed to prove to herself that she still had the ability, the integrity, and the belief to start over. Mariana brought in a cup of coffee, placed it on the desk without saying a word, and turned to leave. Renata looked up and softly said, "Thank you." Mariana stopped, stood still for a moment, then let out a breath as if releasing a burden that had pressed on her chest for far too long. "I read the file you translated yesterday. Every line felt like a slap to the way I had thought for the past 2 years. I am sorry." Renata smiled, a gentle nod shared between two women who had once existed in completely separate worlds. "I forgave long ago." That answer did not need emphasis, but it was enough to let Mariana leave the room with a lighter step. Danilo did not interfere with her work. He now merely signed off on expenses, but every important foreign language document had to pass through Renata's hands before it could be approved. Each time she placed a translated file on his desk, he no longer questioned or double-checked it, because after she had once pointed out critical errors in a standard contract the company had used for years, he had learned to trust. Trust not out of reputation, but out of competence. Renata knew well that someone like Danilo would not change because of sentiment. He changed when made to see concrete evidence. She did not lecture him on ethics. She simply did her job flawlessly until others had no choice but to acknowledge it. She never told anyone about what happened at university, about being dismissed after exposing a diploma-selling ring. But one morning, Amanda stumbled upon an old news article with Renata's picture under the headline, "Professor Exposes Corruption and Loses Job," and once again the entire office shook. The article spread in private messages. No one dared to ask directly, but the information dug deeper into how each of them saw her. No one thought she was just lucky anymore. They understood she was someone who had walked through the darkest corners of justice and paid a price to keep her name clean. And she had fallen hard, fallen so far that she had to walk through this place with a mop to feed her child, to support her husband, and not drown in bitterness. But she never lost herself. One late afternoon, as Renata was preparing to leave the office, Danilo called her in. He held in his hands a new project from Hungary this time, a major case involving cross-border inheritance between 3 countries. He did not ask if she could handle it. He simply said one line: "This project could change the scale of the company. I need you to be the lead advisor for the deal." Renata took the file, said nothing. But her eyes told him he had placed his trust in the right person. On the way home, Renata sat on the bus, clutching the folder, her head resting against the window. The city was still noisy as always. People still jostled, argued, and pushed each other off the sidewalk. But inside her, there was a quiet peace. She did not need applause for her victory. She just needed to get home, unlock the door, see the lights on, see her daughter's bright smile, and her husband reheating the soup from that afternoon. Life had never been easy for her, but for the first time, she felt she was on the right path. That evening, her daughter ran up to proudly show her the top biology score in class. Renata hugged her, said nothing. Inside her, there was a pride too deep for words. She had once been forced off the lectern, pushed into the shadows of a basement job where people did not even bother remembering her name. But from that very place, she had used her soap-soaked hands to gather the fragments of her life into a new chance. She did not win because she was handed an opportunity. She won because she never let go of her values. And the next morning, when she returned to the office, stepped into that room, turned on the computer, and continued the translation where she left off, no one dared to call her the janitor again. They called her by name. They knocked before entering. They apologized when they interrupted. And they waited for her final opinion before submitting important documents. She never had to stand up and declare who she was. Because now everyone already knew, and for the first time in that office, the name Renata Silva was no longer misspelled. Not long after Renata was appointed as the lead advisor for the Hungary deal, an urgent internal meeting was called to review the entire process of translation and legal verification in the company's international transactions. Danilo invited the legal team, the Foreign Affairs Department, and the Finance Division, but for the first time, the person seated at the center of the table was not the deputy director or a department head. It was Renata sitting there as if she had always belonged in that seat. There were no designer dresses, no expensive high heels, only a thick file she had marked with red ink down to every single period. The meeting lasted 3 hours, yet no one looked away from her. Renata did not speak in a harsh tone, nor did she use jargon to overwhelm others. She presented each point in plain but precise language, offering clear evidence, referencing regulations across 3 countries, and ending with a proposal of 7 key adjustments that only someone deeply versed in both law and language could identify. No one argued. Those who once were masters of negotiation now sat quietly taking hurried notes like students in the class of a true professor. When the meeting ended, Danilo stood up first and raised his hand to thank her. That gesture, once a luxury to anyone at the lower ranks, was now offered to someone who just weeks ago had held a mop. She was not surprised. She was not thrilled. She simply nodded, like someone who had long known her value was finally seen in the right light. Yet Renata understood that recognition in a meeting room was only the first step. Real change would come from shifts in everyday behavior. So she continued walking softly through the office, claiming no spotlight, pushing no one aside. But the way people looked at her had changed. They no longer avoided eye contact or pretended not to see her. They looked directly at her. And for the first time, they saw themselves in her gaze. Not disdain, but a reflection of the prejudice they had once carried without knowing. Amanda began asking her opinion whenever she needed to write emails to foreign partners. Mariana invited her to lunch at the canteen, not out of courtesy, but with a genuine desire to learn. Paula, at reception, who once redirected clients when Renata walked in, now greeted her each morning with a smile full of gratitude rather than awkwardness. And the most surprising was Martin, the young man who once laughed behind the restroom door at her German pronunciation, now handing her a stack of documents needing grammar review, along with a clumsy but sincere apology. One Friday afternoon after hours, as Renata was getting ready to leave the office, Danilo stepped into her room. No assistant, no documents, just a version of Danilo, rarely seen his face marked with quiet thought. He sat down across from her, silent for a moment, then asked a question that seemed to still the air. If I had not asked you to translate in front of everyone that day, would I have ever seen the real you? She looked at him, neither surprised nor blaming. Number, you probably never would. But that is not just your fault. Most people only see value when it comes wrapped in a form they are willing to accept. Danilo nodded slowly, as if every word she said was carving through an old wall in his mind. Then he sighed. I used to think this company needed better media coverage, stronger legal teams. But now I realize what it needs most is to relearn how to see people. She did not respond. She stood, picked up her coat, and smiled softly like a full stop at the end of a conversation that did not need closure. That evening, when Renata got home, her husband was peeling fruit under the soft kitchen light. He looked up with a proud smile he could not hide. You were just on the local finance news. She was surprised. News had traveled faster than she expected. The short segment told of a woman who was once a university lecturer cast out for exposing corruption, who had become a janitor to support her family and now stood as a senior advisor in a global corporation. There was no sorrowful narration, no tears. Just a series of daily images intercut with office camera footage where she sat translating documents under the golden afternoon sun, her hands still rough from those laborious years. She did not turn away. She watched it all. Because for the first time, her life was not told as a tragedy, but as a quiet anthem of someone who never gave up on herself, even when everything else did. On Monday morning, as she entered the office, the security guard bowed his head in greeting. The staff no longer ignored her presence. A few even initiated conversations, not out of curiosity, but from a genuine interest in learning something from her. And in the elevator standing next to her were two young interns. One of them turned and asked, "Could you help me understand this contract?" Renata nodded. In that moment, she knew she had stepped into a different chapter. No longer someone seeking recognition, but someone helping others dismantle the invisible blindness caused by prejudice. That office, that company, was no longer a place she had to tolerate just to survive. It had become a place she helped transform, not through slogans, not through authority, but through quiet excellence and an unshakable character. And the strange thing was, once she no longer needed to prove herself, the world began to listen. Not because she was loud, but because she had been the voice they had ignored for far too long. And now no one wanted to stay silent anymore. In the final month of the year, as the city began to glow with holiday lights, Danilo Group held its annual year-end party at a grand hotel. The atmosphere was festive. People were laughing, taking photos, raising glasses to celebrate everything they had accomplished. For the first time, the name Renata Silva appeared on the guest list as a keynote speaker listed next to the CEO and the CFO. No one objected. No one found it strange. Because after a year, she was no longer a phenomenon but a foundation, no longer a surprise but a cultural pillar of the company. When the spotlight turned on, no one stepped back, but no one rushed forward. Renata walked out, not in a glamorous gown, but in a modest black suit. A crisp white collar, her hair neatly tied back, and eyes that carried the depth of someone who had passed through mud and now reflected peace. She did not read from a paper. She did not open with formal thanks. Her voice rose steady and clear without a microphone. A year ago, I walked in here through the back door. No one asked my name. No one cared what I used to do. I was the one mopping the floors, the one cleaning up after nights like these, quietly collecting what was left after everyone had gone. The room went still. Some of the people sitting there had been at last year's event drinking and laughing as she crouched to pick up scraps from under their shoes. Now they listened as if every word struck something in their conscience. But I do not say this to accuse anyone. I say it so we all remember that inside anyone, no matter where they stand, there is a fire that never went out. All it takes is for someone to notice, for someone just once to stop and ask who you are and what brought you here. She did not speak long. She shared the journey from her first translation in front of Danilo to the negotiation with Hungarian partners to the television feature that changed everything. But she did not boast. She spoke as someone who had been crushed by judgment, who walked through darkness without letting the light inside go dim. She said, "What I did was never to prove I was better than anyone. I just wanted to be seen as a whole person, not through job titles, not through the clothes I wore, not through where I came from. And if today I stand here, I stand for everyone who has ever been dismissed simply because they chose to stay silent." In the front rows, some eyes filled with tears, not from emotion, but from shame. The awkward smiles, the lowered gazes, all signs of reflection that no one asked them to make, but now could not escape. Renata did not say more. She closed her speech with a sentence that made the entire room rise in applause without needing to be told. When you look up and see someone as a person rather than a position, you have already begun to do the right thing. The clapping did not stop, but she did not linger on stage. She stepped down, returning to her table as if her speech had been just another task for the day. Danilo came over and clinked glasses with her, not out of formality. He looked at her, tilting his head slightly, as if trying to learn to see someone all over again. She knew it was not guilt, it was real change. The kind of change that only happens when a person spends enough time facing themselves in the mirror. After the speech staff came up to congratulate her, some asked for photos. Others simply held her hand as if placing a quiet hope in it. She accepted them all with calm, because she knew that true honor is not in being celebrated, but in making someone else want to be better. The party ended. Renata did not stay late. She had no need to impress anyone. As she walked out of the hotel lobby, it had begun to drizzle. The year's last cold wind slipped through her coat, but she did not shiver. She walked slowly along the sidewalk past the streets, where she once pushed cleaning carts and picked up broken glass no one noticed. Now every paving stone seemed to reflect a soft golden light, no longer dull like the memories. She turned back and looked at the lit-up building behind her, not out of nostalgia, but to be sure that this time when she walked away, she did so with her head held high and nothing left to hide. That night when she came home, her daughter was still awake. The girl stood at the door holding a letter written in purple ink. "Mommy, today I told my teacher that you are the bravest person I know." She asked what you do. I said, "My mom does not just translate languages, she translates people's hearts from apathy to kindness." Renata held her close, her eyes moist, but tears did not fall because she no longer needed recognition. She had received the highest acknowledgement a mother could hope for. The belief of her child, when that child understood she had grown up in the hands of someone who never gave up her dignity. When the lights went out and the house fell silent, Renata sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and reviewed the final notes of the next project. A project about education providing scholarships for students of color who had once been rejected for where they were born or what they looked like. She was not just a translator of documents. She was helping write new futures for those who had once been like her. And in that moment, she understood something deeply. Every translation has the power to change a destiny. But the greatest translation of all is to rewrite your own life with your own hands and an unbroken heart. Renata walked into the auditorium of the University of Languages and Social Sciences on a morning filled with gentle sunlight. This was the place where she had once taught, once walked the halls, with dreams of passing knowledge to the next generation, and also the place that had pushed her aside for daring to challenge outdated academic systems. Now, after nearly 10 years of absence, she returned as a guest of honor at an international conference on liberal education and social transformation, not as a researcher and not as a victim, but as a real voice, a living proof that one could be reborn without waiting for permission. When the auditorium doors opened, every eye turned toward the woman, whose face was familiar, but whose gaze had changed. No longer the hurried look of a lecturer under pressure, but the calm presence of someone who had passed through storms and no longer trembled under the gaze of others. She did not wear the traditional dress like the other female speakers. She chose a simple outfit in earth tones, blending quietly into the setting, yet standing out in a way no one could explain. That serenity gave her words a rare weight. Not because she had once stood at a podium, but because now she herself was the lesson. Her speech began with a question. Have you ever thought about who you are if you fall out of the system? No one answered. Renata continued without notes. Her language was not decorative, but it stirred something deep. She spoke of the journey from standing at a lectern to working as a hospital aide, then mopping floors in finance towers, and finally translating international contracts to save million-dollar deals. She did not speak to impress. She spoke so people could see that strength is not something earned when things go well, but something that rises from within when no one else is there. A young lecturer stood up and asked how to keep faith when the entire environment turns its back on you. Renata looked at him without hesitation. Do not wait for others to believe in you. Believe in what you are becoming, even if it has no name yet. Because rejection is temporary, but real growth cannot be taken away if you keep walking. That answer did not bring applause. It brought stillness, as if someone had quietly placed a mirror in front of every person there. After the conference, the university dean personally invited her to return to her teaching position. She thanked him, but declined. Not because she no longer loved teaching, but because her mission had grown beyond the classroom. She was writing a book, not an academic one, but a bilingual essay collection on character and language where she gathered all the experiences she had lived, taught clean through, translated, stood up from, remained silent for, and was finally heard. She wrote in Portuguese, translated it into English, then edited in French each sentence, a slice of real life no textbook teaches, but the most human lesson she could leave behind. The book had not been published yet, but an international organization for social equity had already offered to sponsor the rights and place it in the libraries of more than 30 universities. Not because of who she was, but because her story changed how people saw those pushed to the margins. No longer a tale of pity, but a wake-up call that true justice only exists when the forgotten are invited back to the table. On her way home, Renata stopped by a small bookstore. She went to the children's section looking for books for her daughter, her hands grazing the colorful covers. A little boy stood nearby, flipping through a thick picture book. He turned to his mother and asked, "Mom, why is everyone in this book white?" The mother was startled and brushed it off with a laugh. But Renata did not laugh. She knelt down and whispered, "Would you like to read a book with someone who looks like you?" The boy nodded. She pulled from her bag a test copy of her manuscript, a children's story about a morning, when a mother came home from her cleaning shift, held her son close, and told him that he could grow up to be anyone as long as he never forgot to love himself. The boy took the book, eyes bright, as if someone had translated his dreams into something he could hold. At home, she sat by the window as sunset spilled across the old wooden table. Every afternoon like this, she spent an hour writing not to meet a deadline, but because it was the 1 hour she truly returned to herself. In that silence, she remembered those who had laughed at her, who never looked her in the eye, who told her to clean the bathrooms like she was nameless, and she did not blame them. She knew they were only repeating what society had programmed into them. But if one day they read her book and learn the true story behind the woman who mopped floors and translated deals with hands once cracked from cleaning chemicals, they would fall silent. And in that silence, a seed of awareness might begin to grow. When night fell and the city slept, Renata kept writing. Every word she typed was not just a paragraph, but another translation for lives still unheard. Because she knew that the most important translation was not in million-dollar contracts, but in how we translate a human being from judged to respected. And she was translating word by word, sentence by sentence, each broken piece of herself to mend a world where everyone deserves a voice. When the International Organization for Human Development chose Renata as the keynote speaker for its annual awards ceremony, no one objected, no votes were needed. The woman who had once been removed from the classroom, who had once been treated like air in boardrooms, now became the voice representing millions whose names had never been spoken right. Her appearance was not fueled by media buzz or carefully edited interviews. She did not need a personal brand, did not need a public relations team. Her unfiltered and raw journey was the passport that opened every door in the most natural way. People did not see her as a model to be worshipped, but as a mirror through which they could see their own wounds and begin to heal. The ceremony took place in the largest hall of the Capitol. Under warm amber lights, people in tuxedos and evening gowns waited quietly for her to step on stage. She did not rush, nor did she pause for poses. Her steps were steady but not stiff. Each movement echoed a life once broken and now stitched back together by sheer determination. When she stood before the microphone, she did not clear her throat or glance at a script. Everything had already soaked into her blood, lived in every cell. Her voice rose just enough, not loud, not soft, as if she was speaking privately to each person in the room. I did not come here to tell my story, because that story, while it may seem unfamiliar to you, is happening every day to millions of others. Talented people being denied opportunities because of their address. Single mothers laughed at because they speak foreign languages better than their own bosses. Children of color reading books where no one looks like them. She did not pause for too long, nor did she fill the space with meaningless words. Every phrase was a gentle blade slicing into the numb corners of the listeners' minds. But she did not let it bleed. She followed with a soft cloth of hope and transformation. I have translated documents, translated contracts, even translated emotions between people who did not share the same language. But the hardest translation of my life was translating myself from an invisible shadow into a person with weight. And when I did that, I realized no one has to wait for validation to have value. Value does not come from how others look at you. It comes from how you refuse to abandon yourself when everything else collapses. The hall fell silent. Those who had sat through countless speeches now stayed still without blinking. Not because they had never heard these words before, but because no one had ever said them in the voice of someone who had lived them, breathed through them, and still stood after them. She did not show statistics. She used no fancy graphics. Each word was a true scar, and because it was real, the audience could feel the pain, and only then could they understand what healing truly meant. She did not end with applause. She simply nodded like a punctuation mark placed with precision. The entire room stood not because anyone commanded it, not because there was a signal. These were people who had read reports, sat through long meetings about social justice without ever truly feeling injustice in their bones, now bowing to a woman who had once bent down to scrub floors just to survive another day. After the ceremony, someone asked her how she managed to keep her kindness after being treated so unfairly. She smiled gently. Because I knew if I became bitter, then the one who won would not be me, but the system that tried to silence me. I did not forgive because they deserved it. I forgave because I deserved to live without carrying the weight of resentment. When she returned home, Renata did not throw a celebration. She simply set a small table in the garden where she and her daughter shared a quiet dinner under a yellow light dangling above the paper flower vines. Her daughter spoke of school, of being chosen as the group leader that day because she had written an essay about the most inspiring person in her life. The girl had not chosen a superhero nor a celebrity. She had chosen her mother. And in the final lines of the essay, she wrote that her mother did not need anyone to cheer for her because she was the one who lit her own stage. Renata looked at her daughter, said nothing, simply placed her hand on her head and felt a kind of peace that had no name. That night, she received an email from a major publisher. They wanted to print her book, keeping the title exactly as it was in the original draft. The final translation. As she reread the final chapters, she realized she was no longer writing in the voice of someone who had been wounded. The tone was no longer soaked in pain. It had grown clearer, calmer, like when someone has cried long enough to learn how to smile without hiding. And in that moment, she understood that what mattered was not how many people would read the book, but who would begin to rewrite themselves after reading it. The next morning, as sunlight spilled across the white wall where she kept her bookshelf, Renata rose, made a cup of hot tea, and opened the window. Outside, the city buzzed just like any other day. But inside her, everything had gone still. Not because she had reached the top, but because she was no longer torn between proving her worth and simply living by it. And that is the greatest freedom any person can reach. Not the freedom to speak, but the freedom to be heard without speaking. Not the freedom to introduce yourself, but to be trusted without saying a word. Not the freedom to fight for space, but to simply exist fully in this world as yourself.